Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Oxford Martin School for our Thursday afternoon seminar series, which is related to the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations. And if you haven't picked up a copy of our report on the way in, perhaps you might like to pick it up, hopefully on the way out, as a bit of sort of light Christmas reading. And we released this report just over a month ago, and we've been absolutely delighted with the response we've had to the Commission's report. So my name's Natalie Day as well, and I'm the Head of Policy at the Oxford Martin School, and I was responsible for the Secretariat that created the Commission report. We did all the sort of hard work in the background behind Pascal Lamy and the other sort of great commissioners that were part of the group, and we were very honoured to have such a distinguished group of people come together to try and think about many of the issues that Simon will talk about today and in other seminars that we've had here today. But essentially at the Martin School we set up the Commission over 12 months ago because we were increasingly concerned about what we perceived to be this increasing short-termism within governments and business and other sort of policy-making, decision-making structures. And given that we spend all our time worrying about sort of the big global challenges, which obviously require a longer-term horizon, whether that's climate change or food security or increasing inequality, we felt it was very important to bring together some very eminent people, and you'll see in the report such great names that came together to really try and tackle this issue of increasing short-termism and also the gridlock of modern politics, how increasingly difficult it is to get the action that we require on so many of today's big global challenges. So certainly through this seminar series, each Thursday we've picked one of the different challenges that the Commission focused on. So we've looked at issues of geopolitics, of resources, questions of governance. Next week we'll be holding a seminar on health issues. But today we're absolutely delighted that Professor Simon Caney has kindly offered to do this seminar for us today, and Simon's work is absolutely central to these questions about how you can embed longer-term structures and processes within decision-making structures to enable governments and business and others to really think about these longer-term challenges and try to come up with sort of innovative solutions about how you can embed longer-term structures and focus into what is in a very increasingly short-termist, 24/7 demands on decision-makers' time. So we're very pleased to have Simon with us, and we're looking forward to a really rigorous discussion today. Just a brief introduction about Simon, who we're delighted is a co-director in the Oxford Martin program on human rights for future generations, and he's also a professor in political theory and the director of the Centre for Study of Social Justice. So we're very pleased to have Simon with us today to talk us through sort of governance, sustainability and future generations, designing institutions with a long-term focus. So thank you very much, Simon.
Thanks very much, Natalie. Can everyone hear me at the back? Just check. So yeah, the focus of what I'm going to talk about today is thinking about how we should design institutions to take the long-term perspective into account. There seems to be a series of problems which have sort of the causes take place now, but the impacts come and bite us much later in time. This is at the heart of the report that Natalie discussed, and I really would strongly recommend that you pick up a copy if you haven't already, because it's incredibly rich in detail and coverage and depth of these kind of issues. It's grappling with a really hard question, though. We've had discussions about governance since Aristotle, if not before, but those thinkers and those after them often didn't grapple with the question of what you do with policies which have enormous long-term impacts. So the aim of this, then, is to think innovatively about the options available to us. Just to make clear, I'm going to talk about what I call the intergenerational problem, and that could mean a couple of things. When we talk about short-termism, we might be worried about our sort of self-interest in the short term. We might think that governments and ourselves were just not very good at making policies that suit ourselves in 20, 30, 40 years' time. That's why maybe pensions should be and are compulsory to ensure that people actually look after themselves in the future. So that's category one up there. And then there are, the current generation of young people, and I'm going to refer to them as future generations, although they still obviously exist, because they're not really taking part in the decisions. They're not having an impact in the political process or the economy, but they are deeply affected by it. And then there's a third category, the yet to be born. So short-termism affects all of these, but my focus is on 2 and 3. The examples will easily spring to mind about the kinds of problems with a long-term phenomenon attached to them. Climate change, resource depletion, the moving to an aging society, world population growth going from 7 to 8 to 9 billion, but also pensions reform, who should pay for education, and whether we should limit the deficit on a budget that can be passed on from one generation to another. These are all within this category of the intergenerational problem. But actually, I think we should start by saying there are at least 3 problems here. And we should note this because it probably makes a difference to the sort of solutions one might consider. So there's epistemic ones, which is we find it really hard to know what will happen in 20, 30, 40 years' time, let alone 100 years' time. And if you bear in mind that when you emit a ton of carbon, that 25% of it is still in the atmosphere in 1,000 years' time, and 10% of it is still in the atmosphere in 100,000 years' time, our ignorance is going to be staggering in those contexts. Think back to 1,000 years from now and imagine what they could have thought we would be doing now. So we have an epistemic problem. We have a motivational problem, a lack of concern for people's interests in the future. Our own often, but also maybe children, maybe future generations not yet born. And then thirdly, there's a sort of what I think of as a commitment problem or an assurance problem, which is even if you can motivate people to do things in the here and now, how can we be sure that other people in the future will do their bit? So we might want to try and have binding commitments or lock-ins that ensure that not only do we make sacrifices, but the next generation and the one after that make their sacrifices. So that's also about motivation, but it's also to do with how could we be assured now that others will do their bit? So when I talk about the intergenerational problem, there are actually at least 3. And I think different solutions will track different problems or different aspects of the problem. So as Natalie said, there was this report that had come out very recently that discusses this. But there's also something in the air. There have been other discussions about this, not as comprehensive and often much more restricted, but just to sort of bring out that these sort of issues are very much with us. There was the Kay review of UK equity markets done by John Kay, which worried about short-termism in equity markets. There's ongoing discussions at the UN. The Secretary General in August issued a report containing recommendations for a UN High Commissioner for future generations. The House of Commons had a select committee report on governing the future a couple of years ago. And if you look more widely, there's discussions in the public realm about these issues. So David Willits, for example, wrote a book called The Pinch, talking about intergenerational issues. David Runciman, a professor at Cambridge, has recently published a book called The Confidence Trap, about how democracies have a confidence trap, namely that they are quite good at solving problems, but because of this, they don't take the precautions necessary to avoid them, so they stumble into them. But then they sort of cope quite well with them, but driven by the hubris that they've coped quite well with them, they stumble into the next one. And so he's worried also about short-termism. So here's the question then. How can we try and design institutions so that they cope with the intergenerational problem and are ethically defensible? I add that last bit, which you might think is obvious, because some people have quite authoritarian solutions to this problem. If only we had sort of well-motivated guardians in charge, then it would be sorted. So the first thing I want to do, and I should say, and it's probably apparent, by training I'm an analytical political philosopher, so I always want to take things apart and put them in their most basic core form and then work out from that. So the first thing I want to do is to work out what are the ingredients that make this a problem. That's the 4 elements. And then to look at some political proposals people make, some legal stroke judicial proposals people make, and then talk about whether we should go beyond talking about institutional reform and also look at more cultural types of reform in our practices and our belief systems. So what are the ingredients or the elements of the intergenerational problem? Well, one is that we have obligations to those who come after us, where, remember, I'm including the young, but also the not yet born. If you don't think that, then it's a lot easier to deal with this because there isn't so much of a problem. A former fellow of Magdalen, which is my college, is famous for saying he didn't see what he owed posterity because posterity had never done anything for him. That's arguable whether it had or it hadn't, but if that's true, then life is a lot easier. But I'm assuming that we do. And I want to say a little bit about the 2 aspects because some people have quite modest notions of what we should leave for others. Like we should just leave them enough. So the Brundtland Commission talked about respecting the needs of the future generations. I think of that as being a sort of a sufficiency level. But others have much more ambitious visions, namely we should leave the future people no worse off than we are, or as well off as we could possibly do. And if we have those kind of goals, I favour the more egalitarian one, then it's going to be a hard challenge. And then we also have to ask fair shares of what? Is it wealth? Is it happiness? Is it just robust institutions? So Edmund Burke, writing in the French Revolution, was worried about intergenerational issues, but he thought it was all about leaving robust institutions to future people, not tearing apart existing ones. Or you might think that what we should leave is partly things of particular items, things of great natural beauty or works of art or cultural achievements. So there are many things you might be thinking of that you think should be preserved. I mean, often people do focus on wealth, but given the literature on wealth and happiness, you might ask why? Why should we focus on that? So the first thing is we owe things to future people. The second is that we can make things really bad for them and quite good for them. So I've mentioned the time lag with climate change, and nuclear waste has a similar kind of time lag. And this might make you think, well, is this a really new problem? So that's why I put William Stanley Jevons's book from the 19th century, The Coal Question, because he was worried about Britain running out of coal and thought it was going to be catastrophic. Or Malthus and Condorcet worried about population explosion. Thomas Jefferson had an interesting worry. He was worried about passing on debt, and he was worried about sort of democracy and sovereignty, about earlier generations being able to bind later ones. He thought that was unfair. He thought later ones should be able to undo the Constitution and make their own one. So these issues have been around, but I think there are 3 things that worry me about the current one, which is 1, the time lag is much longer than any of these previous problems. Second thing is the enormity of the impact. And the third thing is about reversibility. If someone passes a law in an earlier generation we don't like, we can undo it. If they make a constitutional amendment, we can undo that. But with climate change and nuclear waste, there's not much you can do if you inherit nuclear waste or a world that has, say, a 4-degree or 5-degree increase. So the time lag, the magnitude and the irreversibility, I think, should lead us to think these are new and distinctive types of problem. So what's the other ingredient? Well, one is, suppose we had obligations to future people and we could have this massive impact, but we're all perfectly functioning human beings that are fully informed and well motivated, then we wouldn't have a problem. So what really are the problems with human nature here? There's an epistemic one about lack of knowledge. There's also things that we're not very good at. So we're not very good at dealing with creeping problems. So if there's a catastrophe, we can react well to that. But if sea levels go up a little bit, like a centimetre a year, we barely notice. So the human mind isn't very good at dealing with certain kinds of long-term problems. It's not very good from a motivational point of view as well. So the obvious one is self-interest. I mean, that's going to be hard to address from the intergenerational point of view. But there are other issues that affect human nature that might mean we're ill-equipped to deal with the long term. So the second one is that many psychologists think there are two modes of reasoning we engage in. There's an affective mode, which is triggered by emotion, personal experience, personal encounter with a phenomenon, or the so-called identifiable victim. That hits us in the gut, and we can react to that. And then the second mode of reasoning is statistical. It proceeds by general reasoning, abstract argument, and logic. And Elke, I never know if it's Weber or Weber, because she's American, has done some interesting work on the psychology of climate change and why people don't react to it, why it doesn't scare people. And she argues that when it comes to risk and uncertainty, our affective processes are the really powerful ones. So if we witness something that is a risk or uncertainty, we react to that very strongly. But if we're presented it in abstract, formal statistical models, we don't. We think, well, it might happen, it won't happen to me though. Think about people's reaction to people who suffer from illness because of smoking. Those who know someone who has died because of lung cancer tend to react very differently from those who kind of know the general facts and figures. So this leaves us ill-equipped to deal with future people because we don't have the visceral effect of confronting them. And then there are other just, normal features that we encounter elsewhere, like weakness of will and temptation, and that human beings seem to be prone to pure time preference. We tend to prefer pleasures now rather than later. So this is another core ingredient then of the intergenerational problem. If this is how we're hardwired, then we're not going to be very good at coping with long-term problems. But some of these features of human nature afflict us in the here and now, like weakness of will and temptation and ignorance and self-interest. But this is where the fourth ingredient is. Political institutions often perform a valuable role because they can curb some people's self-interest to protect other people's. So here are three things that we expect accountability mechanisms to do. We can throw the rascals out. It's possible if we're alive at the same time, but if the risk bearers are 100 years in the future, they can't exercise that mechanism. Second mechanism is epistemic. If we have victims here and now, they can tell us what's wrong and why things are not working. The voice of the future is not something we hear. And then the third one is we react when we see things, when we confront refugees or poverty or famine or war, but out of sight, out of mind. So another mechanism by which we can use institutions to correct human failings doesn't really seem to work in the intergenerational one. So we wouldn't have a problem if we owed nothing to future people, or if we weren't able to have adverse effects on them, or if we're super duper well informed, appropriately motivated, or we had institutions that could deal with human imperfections. But these conditions all obtain, right? None of those conditions obtain. We do have obligations. We are able to harm people in the future. We're not paragons of moral virtue, and we don't have the institutional framework that sort of curbs these problems. So what do we do? Well, there's two variables in there, actually. There's the human nature aspect, and there's the institutional aspect. So one response, and it comes from colleagues here at the Oxford Martin School, Julian Savulescu, and his Swedish co-author Ingmar Persson, is to say, target human nature. So they talk about enhancing human beings so they're more cooperative. I'm going to focus on the other variable, institutional reform. I should stress they're going to interact, right? One thing about institutional reform is it will impact on the way humans behave. So let's think about this. Now, I said there was something in the air. There were discussions about designing institutions for the long term. And there is a recent history, not altogether happy, of such institutional proposals. So Israel had a commission for future generations, as you can see now, disbanded. Hungary had one that, as of the 1st of January 2012, was morphed into another institution. Maybe a happier story is Finland. Finland had a select committee for future generations that was created on a temporary basis in 1993, then a permanent basis in 2000. But there are other ones, like Scotland has a Futures Forum, which is designed to make people think about the long term, created by the Scottish Parliament. So, how do we think about reforming these institutions? The report discusses quite a few of these proposals, in fact maybe all of the proposals. I want to categorize them into two types. There are some which are political and legislative, that try and affect policy making, and then there are some which are more legal, judicial, which work on the courts, or the judicial system. And this may not work, this distinction, it may be a bit crude, but I see the first as trying to empower future generations, to try and give them a voice. And the second type I see is trying to disempower the present, to tie the present's hands. I mean, just to give a comment on the second, this is often what we do, actually, when we want long-term decision-making. Trust funds do this, or banks do this. If you invest money in certain ways, you basically tie your hands so you can't use it for a while. Oxford colleges stipulate they can't use more than a certain percentage of their endowment. The famous example that will spring to the mind of philosophers is Jon Elster's Ulysses and the Sirens, where Ulysses agreed to be bound to the mast to prevent himself giving into temptation. So that's a second kind, which tries to bind people. But I'm going to talk most about the first kind. So how do we design policy making to encourage people to think about the future? I think there are 4 preliminary points. One is, just to reiterate something I said earlier, these are very different problems and they may have quite different solutions. So pensions reform or educational reform, there are overlapping generations of young, middle and old that will coexist over time. And ideas of reciprocity may operate there. And then there are problems which take place over the hundreds or thousands of years. So lesson 1 is we shouldn't expect a silver bullet that solves all of these. Lesson 2 is, I think there are 2 criteria we should have in mind, which is, 1, does it work when compared to other possible arrangements? And it's got to be with other possible arrangements. I've come to the conclusion, which is somewhat pessimistic, that if you think any of these are going to prevent the problems occurring, that's just too high a standard. But we have to compare it and see what would do a better job. And the second thing is we have to think, what reforms are there that don't violate other moral norms we have? I mean, maybe, for example, some of you would reject the idea from Julian and Ingmar that we should encourage people to take certain drugs to make them more cooperative. Maybe you have objections of that kind. Or maybe you think authoritarian regimes actually deal with the long term better, but you think democracy is intrinsically fairer mode of government. Here are 2 other things that we need to know here. I find there's a lot of proposals out there, and we need to kind of have a grid by which we compare them. So we need to know who are they empowering and what powers are they being given. Because the really existing commissions for future generations that have taken place and the proposals often differ hugely on the powers. Some can be very meagre, like informing people or advising. Some have slightly more teeth, like delaying decisions. Some might be to actually give legislative authority to independent future generations councils. Some just want to monitor them. And I think for any of them, we need to know, do they actually get at the root cause? And do they give us a good mechanism by which we think they can actually deal with the underlying problem? So I'm really trying to break the problem down into its component parts and think, how do we deal with the root causes here? And this is something I've intimated already, but given human nature as it is, and given the time lag, I think it would be unrealistic to expect any political process to be just as effective for intergenerational government as we would want it to be for intragenerational government. So the challenge is to minimize the underlying tendencies for myopia. I think prevention is too hard a call. So here's a list of things that you will find if you read about this, and I think very many of them, not all of them, are in the report. And it's an attempt just to be really comprehensive. Some of them you might think of as being the wrong side of the sanity-insanity sort of borderline. But I'm just trying to get a picture of all the possible levers one could pull. The ones in yellow are the ones I think are most promising, and I'm thinking in particular of long-term problems. But let me go through some of these. So I'm going to start with the first three together. So some people talk about, well, we could reform voting rights of the electorate. So Philippe van Parijs, the eminent political philosopher, had a provocative article called Disenfranchising the Elderly. It was prompted by visiting California and finding that elderly voters turned out en masse and voted heavily for packages that went to the elderly, and because they were a disproportionately large group, younger generations lost out. So he says, well, we could try and do things like lower the voting age, or give plural votes to parents according to how many children they have got. Or you could have a system that makes it compulsory to vote if you're below a certain age. Or if you don't like the coercion, you could have one that subsidizes or incentivizes people to vote if they're younger. Or you could have one that stipulates that any legislation that is passed has to have a majority amongst, say, the 18 to 25 cohort. So there's all kinds of ways of tweaking these. I'm not going to canvass that route. It doesn't deal with the very long term. It might deal with younger generations, but it doesn't deal with climate change. It doesn't deal with biodiversity loss. I don't think it will deal with nuclear waste. And there will be worries about political maturity and lowering the voting age. So you might have as an alternative youth representation, which often takes place in international negotiations. But for the moment, and this is all at a rather exploratory stage, I think step one is not what I'm going to canvass. But let's go through. Step two. So some green activists and political theorists have said what we should have is a body of people in the legislature, so elected representatives, whose job it is to represent future generations. And they're thinking of environmental causes. Andy Dobson, for example, thinks that this should be elected by a subset of the population who are members of green political organizations. Christian Eckley says, no, come on, you've got to have everyone having a vote. So you might say there are going to be 20, 30 representatives in the House of Commons, or whichever your legislature is, nominated by their parties as representatives for future generations. Now, if they're to be representatives, we normally think that there should be one person, one vote. So it seems that the logical implication of this kind of proposal is to have as many representatives for the future generations as there will be future people. This strikes me as worrisome because A, we don't know how many there will be, and B, if it seems, as it seems likely there will be lots, we're going to have an implausible scenario of having more representatives of the future than are of the present. So I think that's ethically problematic. What about changing the tenure of legislators? I think this is much more doable and feasible and attractive. Think about a representative in Congress who has a tenure period fixed of 4 years, which means effectively when they come in to office, their first thought is running for a re-election. Now, there's two reasons you might favour this, and I think one is not very good, and the other one has some plausibility. So the not very good one is we need to sort of lengthen their motivation. But normally when people make this proposal, they're moving from a 4-year system to a 6-year one. That really isn't going to do very much when it comes to policy making. You know, they're just going to be myopic with a 6-year horizon rather than a 4-year horizon. So the more credible reason, I think, is just that you can't get anything done in 4 years. So it's destructive of any planning, whether long-term, short-term, medium-term. And so 4 years just might be too short for anything. And if you think people would be disposed to act in the interests of future people, but won't because they're always having to run for re-election, but if you just gave them more time, they could actually get down to it, then that would be a reason for favouring it. But that seems quite a mild reason for me. So I'm not against it, but I don't think we should expect a huge change if this were to happen. So here's ones where I think maybe we can hope and expect for more. And I'm going to treat them together because in a way I think they work en masse. And as you'll see if you read the sections in the report, quite a lot of these are done, but they're done in a bitty way. And maybe what we need to do is to pull all of these together because I think they work well collectively rather than individually. So one worry we have about the future is just our massive level of uncertainty and ignorance. That applies to the policy elite, but it also applies to citizens and voters. So I think, I'm switching from 4, I'm going to talk about 4 and 9. I think, to deal with those kind of factors, cognitive failings, we clearly need to have some mechanism of feeding into policy long-term trends. And we clearly need to notify voters about long-term problems with regular updates about creeping problems. And to some extent we have this already. So there is a foresight programme that's part of the UK political process, which reports to the executive, which has long-term horizon scanning reports, which reports on a biannual basis on many other problems, including climate change. I just think we need more of that. We used to have in Britain a Commission for Sustainable Development, which I refer to at the bottom, which you might see as sort of performing a similar epistemic role for the broader public. I mean, the Sustainable Development Commission that was created by Labour but then abolished by the coalition was supposed to report directly to the executives. But there's no reason why one couldn't have such a commission that reported to the public at large, not just the executive, that issued regular updates on where Britain and the world was going in 50 or 100 years' time. Some deliberative Democrats, that is people who are attracted to the idea of having a process of deliberation and reflection for all political decisions, might say, well, what we need to do is have, they do argue for a deliberation day, which is 1 day a year, have it set aside so no company works, no university works, and the people are then supposed to debate and deliberate about political problems. If you really want people to think about this, why don't we have a national deliberative democracy day thinking about the future? And what I'm trying to do here is connect with the underlying psychological problems. The thought that, oh, well, that's all in the future, it's all out of sight, out of mind. Trying to deal with the fact that if it's not confronting us here and now, we tend to ignore it. If we have this information and if we're required once a year to deliberate about it, the one thing we can't do is then ignore it. And it could have impact assessments, updates on how British policies are doing or global policies are doing in tackling these problems. Ignorance is a very nice excuse. I didn't really know about that. So one thing you can do is remove that option away from us. That deals well, I don't say deals, that's too ambitious, that addresses or tries to tackle the cognitive problems we have. But what about more motivational ones? Here's a bunch of things that might help speak to that. And it's drawn a bit from maybe an idealized version of what happens in Finland. What if you had a process like this? When you were a newly elected government, you were required, and this is, I think, part of the Finnish system, you are required after your first year to issue a public statement about what you're going to do about problems with a long-term nature. And you have to deliver this in Parliament. And what if you were required to have a minister who is responsible for future generations? And that is their remit. They can be judged or evaluated in terms of whether they do that or not. Make it concrete, make it so there's a focal point. And what if, and this is again from the Finland case, what if there was a select committee for the future whose job it was then to evaluate the government's statement for the future and hold them to account in Parliament, to ask them to engage in public justification, to explain, well, why are they removing tariffs from this? Why are they not investing in that? And the aim of all of these proposals, which I'm putting together as a composite, is to try and tackle some of the causal factors for myopia, the out of sight, out of mind phenomenon, to deal with temptation and weakness of will. It's much harder to succumb to weakness of will, much harder to succumb to temptation when you know you're going to be hauled up in front of other people and asked, how well have you done at that particular job? Just reflect about jobs that you have or your experience as students when you're asked to account for yourself. And in a way it harnesses self-interest. People often define their interest in terms of the roles they occupy. So if you have a minister for this, it is in their self-interest to make it work. And even if people would rather have an easier life that deals with the short term, they don't like embarrassment, they don't like public humiliation. If you have, there's quite interesting research done on transparency initiatives and compliance. I was once told, this is a slight deviation, but I was once told in Oxford if you skipped your fare on a bus, which I know none of you would do, then you would be fined. But people still went and did it. So then they had an initiative of taking people's photos who fare dodged and then putting that on the bus. And that really does seem to work because that's kind of humiliating and embarrassing. So even if you'd rather get away with it, you don't want to be caught out, you don't want to look bad in the eyes of others. And transparency initiatives often have this role. So if people are required to account for what plans they've made for the future, then it's much harder for them to wriggle out of it. So underlying all of this is an idea of deliberative democracy, about having public reasoning. And the claim is not, this will abolish self-interest, because that's ludicrous. It just makes it harder to focus solely on self-interest. And it induces people a perspective of thinking about how others will see them. So if it's done in a public way, in a transparent way, where they're required to justify their process, if people are able to contest this and challenge this, and if it's done in an inclusive way, then I think those are mechanisms which encourage a more long-term perspective. At the moment, there are climate negotiations going on in Warsaw. I often thought these would be much more effective if they were always housed in somewhere which will suffer acutely from climate change, like Bangladesh. And if all the representatives there weren't in swanky hotels, but lived in the same kind of accommodation that local Bangladeshis did, and then if they were required to explain their policies to, say, Bangladeshis or Indonesians, it has a sort of a taming effect on the sort of things one can say. So no promises of utopia, but an attempt to deal with some of the underlying problems, to deal with some of the drivers of myopic policy making. And I don't think they come at any moral cost, right? It's not that they have any disadvantageous features. What about something more ambitious, though, flirting with non-democratic solutions? I'll talk about judicial mechanisms in a minute, but sometimes people say, look, democracies aren't very good at dealing with the long term. And they make proposals for non-democratic bodies, or bodies that are delegated some role by democratic agents, but they have their own autonomy. So I've heard some people say, well, unelected second chambers, the House of Lords, can take a longer term perspective because it's not beholden to the electorate. And all the accountability mechanisms you might think are actually a problem because they're accountable only to the living but not the not yet born. I put down independent central banks because one of the arguments for having an independent central bank was that they were better at thinking of the long term. So one of the arguments was about time inconsistency and political business cycles. And so the worry was that politicians will adjust interest rates just before elections to try and win the next election. But actually that's very disadvantageous for the economy. It'd be much better to take it out of the hands of the politicians and put them in the hands of independent central banks who don't suffer from that myopic tendency. So that's a non-democratic solution. I mean, it's housed within a democratic system, but it has a non-democratic element. But as I mentioned earlier, some others, have deeper worries about democracy. Runciman, I should say, is not saying we should reject democracy, just that we have a problem. We have a problem that democracies are quite good at coping with problems, but very bad at avoiding them in the first place. And if we have a problem like climate change, that could be quite lethal because we have the confidence. We think we can cope with it, but we might only sort of encounter this, we might only start dealing with it when it's too late. So here are some thoughts that I have about these types of moves. One question is about effectiveness. Are these non-democratic, quasi-non-democratic institutions actually any better at thinking of the long term? I think we have some reason to be skeptical. There was a good report, a good book on central banks published earlier this year by Christopher Adolph, which looked at the career trajectories of people who worked for central banks. And often they work for a central bank and then go into private banking. And he was arguing they're just as myopic as politicians. So why assume that politicians are very short term, but bankers have the impartial long-term perspective? They don't. They often have short-term motives as well, like going and working for private banks afterwards. So you may not think these are any better. You may not think they're necessary. Perhaps the earlier reforms are just sufficient. And you may be worried about democracy. You may think that really you want the people to make decisions and not have unelected bureaucrats or bankers making decisions. But people will still worry, and they'll say, come on, look at countries like China. One advantage that an authoritarian regime has is discipline. It can make sure that things are done. It can compel people. And when it comes to things like temptation and weakness of will, authoritarian regimes have the advantage. So here are a couple of thoughts on that kind of reasoning. Yeah, I think that is true. Authoritarian regimes probably do have that disciplinary advantage. I focus a lot on the environment, so I looked at the literature on democracy and the environment. And you get mixed verdicts, but on none of them does authoritarianism do very well. So some of these studies, like Congleton, Lee and Rovney and Ward and Leitpart, think that democracies fare better. Some of them, like Leitpart, argue that certain types of democracy do particularly well at environmental sustainability indices. So more consensual, less presidential forms do better. And that's something you find in Hugh Ward, 2008. So, I think the general verdict here is that the record of democracies is not terrific, but we haven't got reason to reject it and favour more authoritarian ones. Authoritarian regimes have epistemic limitations. They're very bad at learning from mistakes. Think of Lysenkoism. Whereas democracies, you throw the rascals out, the next ones are very happy to admit the mistakes of the preceding ones. Congleton argues that authoritarian regimes are very short-term because they're always trying to buy patronage and because they have a high turnover. So China is an exception here, but African regimes was what he was thinking of. And there's a more general point about the effect on the general public. Authoritarian regimes are much more prone to instability and uncertainty, and that affects the way that business and individual citizens behave. So when they do, when they have data on whether people are short-term or long-term in their plans, the more unstable the environment they live in, the more uncertain, the much higher the positive pure time discount rate. So I'm going to stick with democracy. But this has all been kind of national level. One thing that I mentioned at the start is the global discussion. There's been ongoing discussions about whether there should be a High Commissioner for Future Generations at the UN level. What sort of things is such an institution expected to do? I put some quotations from the report issued in August, which is one, be an advocate for intergenerational solidarity, undertake research and foster expertise, offer advice on implementation of existing intergovernmental commitments. These all seem to me good, but very modest. Would this really make much of a difference? Do they really tackle the root causes? I think if such an international proposal is to make headway, it has to be much more ambitious. You need something integrated into the policy process. I think one thing that comes out from thinking about the Israeli experience and Hungarian one and the Finnish one is the more that processes incorporate forward-looking institutions right at the heart of policy making, the more likely they are to have an impact. The more you say they can play an advocacy role or provide information, the more they can be marginalised. So why not have such a High Commissioner, but say they should be at COP negotiations, that's Conference of the Parties negotiations that take place each November, December each year for the climate treaties. Why not say that they must be at the WTO, and that WTO negotiators, when they reach agreements at ministerial conferences, must be able to ask questions about the impact of their decisions on the long term. So again, I'm trying to draw back on notions of public justification, of giving agencies a scrutiny role and an impact assessment role. And actually some bodies already do this. So after sort of the Copenhagen Accord of 2009, you found bodies putting together impact assessments of what would happen to emissions if people complied with the kind of agreement that emerged there. And the answer was emissions would rocket. But I think you need a body that's a focal point, that plays a role at trade negotiations, at World Bank discussions, at the G7, and not one that's free-floating, that just has a sort of a reporting and advocacy position. It's got to be locked into the policy process. So there's a list of proposals that we've considered. How long do I have? About 5 minutes? Okay. Some people make judicial proposals. They call for constitutional protections in courts. They call for ombudsman for future generations. Let me just say a few things about these. So when people do this, they're often thinking about having a constitutional article protecting the rights of future generations. Or they're thinking about constitutional balanced budget amendments, which exist, for example, in the German basic law and is an ongoing topic in American politics. And they think, for example, of the role that the International Court of Justice has played, or that domestic courts like the Supreme Court of the Philippines have played, where in both of these cases there was some reference to the interests of future generations. I'll think about ombudsman. So I've mentioned the Hungarian one, which played a quasi-legislative role, but quasi-judicial as well. I mean, I say quasi-judicial because the role there was to report on complaints about failure to comply with intergenerational responsibilities. So some people like Edith Brown Weiss have said this is something we should actively pursue. I have sort of one major sort of reservation or comment about this, which is, suppose these do work, and there's controversy about the extent to which they work. They're really only as good as the laws or constitutional articles that they're charged to uphold. So they're parasitic or dependent on all the political initiatives. If those are no good, then these kind of mechanisms are toothless. Remember I said at the start there was an epistemic problem, there was a motivational problem, and there's a compliance problem. So my suggestion is we think about these as to do with, not with motivating people to pass laws, but they're to do with lock-in and compliance. They're to do with making sure that people stick with the agreements they've made in the past. So they're relevant for binding people. They're what Thomas Schelling, the Nobel laureate for economics, calls strategies of commitment. But they don't get us there in the first place. So they have a follow-up role. I just want to end by, so I've talked a lot about political proposals and a little bit about judicial ones. I think one conclusion I'm coming to when thinking about a lot of these is that you can't put all your eggs in those baskets. There are other things which fall outside the realm of the institutional, which play a major role. And I'm just going to mention three. So one is the norms and modes of governing, the practices by which people govern. Here are three examples. So in this recent book, Anthony King and Ivor Crew look at why British governments have, both Labour and Conservative, have made many decisions that didn't work. And one is, we choose an audit culture that's very short term. We have audits that must appear on an annual basis. Academics will know about the RE or the REF, which has sort of a 5 or 6 year audit. Those encourage people not to think about the long term. So this is not an institutional thing, this is about how we decide to exercise the art of government. And what we're choosing to do is to choose ones which have very short-term time horizons. Here's another example from the Kay review, saying exactly the same about equity markets, where pay and pay bonuses are attached to an annual performance, which is ridiculous if you want people to take the long term into account. Or take Christopher Adolph, who I mentioned earlier about central bankers making decisions which then favour private companies, which they then are employed by. You can just have a practice that says, if you work for a central bank, you may not go into a private bank straight after. You cannot have revolving doors. So this is not about changing the political structures or the legal structures. This is about changing the culture and norms. Here's a second thing we can change. Policymakers are guided by economic methodologies. The Stern review really brought this out because Stern said you should not discount according to location and time, whereas the critics like Nordhaus and Weitzman said it was appropriate to do that. I'm not going to go into this formula for reasons of time, but the crucial thing I want to bring out is if you want policies that serve the long term, you've got to have a methodology that gives adequate weight to the interests of future generations. And at the moment, policymakers tend to have a high positive pure time discount rate. That is, they attach less value to something if it happens in the future. It doesn't matter what institutions you have, if that's your methodology, you will favour the short term. And here's a third thing, which is much more ephemeral, much harder to pin down, but I think very important, which is, it's not just about institutions, it's about the belief systems with which people operate. It's about the values and what kind of ethos prevails over us as citizens and over politicians. So I think institutions don't work unless we have citizens who are appropriately motivated. So we need to inculcate a capacity to think about the long term. The reason I put down the Iroquois nation is that their federation had this rule that when making a decision you must think about how it would look to the next generation. It then came crystallized into the 7th generation rule. So for any policy you should look at it from their point of view. The reason I put David Willits in there is he made this interesting point talking about Scrooge. The thing that made Scrooge change his behaviour was looking at his behaviour from the point of view of the future. So because I've said a lot about institutions, I thought it was important to say that we need more than that. We need a way of looking at things from the future perspective. And often we can do so by drawing on the past. If you propose now to destroy Stonehenge to build a fantastic new car park, people, I hope, would be mortified because they regard it as something of particular significance they've inherited and ought to pass on to the future. So I think as well as institutions, we need to be able to tap into these ideas and values. So here's the summary. The report and I have been trying to explore ways of institutional design for the future. I've talked a lot about the political ones. I'm a political philosopher, that's probably why I do that, but I think that's in a way where the action should be. I've talked a little bit about the role of courts because I think they're useful to ensure that we bind ourselves. And I've talked about 3 other things that I think we should bring into the picture. And that's where I'm going to end. Thanks very much.